Practical effects can make or break a horror film, and Tobe Hooper's Lifeforce is a masterpiece in atmospheric dread that famously drained its victims in the 1985 film. But behind every shocking scene was an army of artists, engineers, stunt performers, and special effects experts working tirelessly to bring this ambitious vision to life. So today, let's step behind the camera and explore how Lifeforce was really made. We begin with the scene when London totally descends into complete chaos. As Colonel Kane and Tom Carlson attempt to escape the city by helicopter, one of the infected, horribly emaciated victims manages to climb onto the outside of the aircraft. The mutated soldier is eventually shot with a flare gun and falls away from the helicopter. The mutated soldier was actually played by a highly trained stunt performer, who was covered in heavy foam latex prosthetic makeup, created by Nick Molly's effects team to make him look like an infected mutated victim. For the exterior shots, the production used a life-size replica of the helicopter's exterior, rather than having the stuntman automatically climb onto a flying helicopter. A giant fan was also used to create the effect of strong wind. The camera angles were carefully positioned to create the illusion that the stuntman was hanging from a helicopter high above London, while keeping his safety equipment and support wires hidden from view. When Colonel Carlson shoots the victim with the flare gun, the impact was created as a practical live-action effect. A small squib and flash material were concealed around the stuntman's chest area. As Carlson fired, an effects technician triggered the charge remotely, producing a sudden flash and burst of smoke that made the flare hit look surprisingly convincing. After being hit, the victim appears to catch fire before falling away from the helicopter. The stunt performer was released in a carefully controlled fall onto large airbags positioned below the set, with the footage then tightly edited together to create the seamless illusion of the zombie being thrown from the helicopter. But the helicopter sequence was only the beginning. By this point in Lifeforce, London has effectively become an apocalyptic battlefield. The streets are filled with panic, infected victims are running through the city, buildings are being destroyed, and the alien vampires are draining human life force in spectacular bursts of energy. For a movie released in 1985, creating destruction on this scale was an enormous visual effects challenge. Director Tobe Hooper worked closely with special effects supervisor John Dykstra, the effects artist best known for his groundbreaking work on Star Wars. Dykstra and his team used a combination of miniature photography, live-action footage, optical effects, and compositing to create the film's large-scale destruction. The production specifically relied on British crews and equipment for many of the live-action and effects elements, while specialized equipment was also brought in from the United States when necessary. One of the most fascinating pieces of miniature work was the destroyed London environment. Rather than constructing an entirely new miniature city from scratch, the production made use of the remains of Tuctonia, a miniature model village near Christchurch that had closed shortly before filming. The miniature structures provided an already detailed environment that could be transformed into the devastated version of London required by the film. The miniature destruction could then be photographed at a scale that made the buildings appear enormous when combined with the live-action footage. Smoke, controlled lighting, physical destruction, and carefully composed photography helped sell the miniature environments as a much larger city. John Dykstra's effects team then combined these elements with optical compositing and other visual effects techniques to create the final images. This was still pre-digital era, so much of the compositing had to be accomplished photographically. Lifeforce relied heavily on traditional optical effects, with miniature and live-action elements being combined on film, rather than assembled inside a modern digital compositing program. But the miniature work was only one part of the destruction. For the scenes taking place at street level, the production used large numbers of extras, stunt performers, military vehicles, practical fire effects, and real locations to create the feeling that London had completely collapsed into chaos. The infected victims were also created largely through practical makeup. Extras were transformed with pale, slicky makeup, darkened eyes, damaged-looking skin, and distressed costumes, giving the crowds a disturbing zombie-like appearance. The result was a combination of several different techniques working together. Real performers and extras for the foreground, practical effects for the immediate destruction, miniature photography for large-scale devastation, and optical compositing to combine everything into a single apocalyptic image. And that's what makes the destruction of London in Lifeforce so impressive. By 1985, Lifeforce was already pushing practical and visual effects far beyond what audiences were accustomed to seeing. Some of the movie's most disturbing images, burned bodies suddenly coming back to life and victims appearing to have their entire bodies drained of life, were created without modern CGI. Instead, the filmmakers relied on a combination of mechanical effects, prosthetic makeup, puppetry, and traditional optical compositing. One particularly memorable creation was known during production as the walking shriveled. Rather than simply putting an actor in heavy makeup and asking them to perform, the effect was built as a highly elaborate mechanical puppet designed to resemble a horribly dehydrated, almost mummified human corpse. The process began with body casts of the performers. These casts provide the foundation for constructing the creature's physical form. A lightweight internal structure was then created, allowing the puppet to retain a recognizable human shape without becoming impossibly heavy. Over that framework, the effects team applied flexible foam latex skin that had been sculpted with deep wrinkles, folds, and severely shrunken features. The goal was to make the corpse look as though every last trace of moisture and life had been pulled from its body. But making it look dead was only half the challenge. The creature also had to move. Hidden mechanical components, cables, articulated joints, and remote control mechanisms were incorporated into the puppet so that individual parts of its body could be manipulated during filming. Operators positioned beneath or outside the camera's view could control movements such as the head, arms, and jaw, allowing the corpse to suddenly rise and grab the doctor. Because the movement was being physically created on set, the puppet had unsettling weight and stiffness that could have been extremely difficult to reproduce convincingly with the technology available at the time. The Lifeforce drain effect. The scene becomes even more impressive when the corpse begins draining the doctor's life force. As the attack takes place, the doctor's face gradually becomes more and more shriveled, making it appear as though the life is literally being sucked out of his body. Instead of attempting to create the entire transformation in one uninterrupted shot, the filmmakers used a progressive makeup approach. The actor was photographed at different stages of the transformation, with increasingly elaborate prosthetic makeup applied between takes. The first stage showed a relatively subtle deterioration. The next introduced deeper wrinkles and more pronounced signs of dehydration, while the final stage transformed the actor into a much more horrifying, severely desiccated version of himself. The production also used practical effects for another disturbing moment inside the laboratory, when a female corpse lying on a stretcher suddenly explodes. For the shot, the effects team used a specially prepared dummy rather than placing an actor directly in harm's way. The body was constructed specifically for the effect, with carefully positioned practical charges incorporated into the setup. When the effect was triggered, the controlled charges violently broke the dummy apart, creating the illusion that the corpse itself was suddenly bursting open. Because the destruction was physically performed in front of the camera, the explosion produced real debris, movement, and interaction with the surrounding environment. Those physical details are a major reason why practical effects from this era can still feel so visceral today. One of the earliest sequences in Lifeforce immediately gives the audience a glimpse of how ambitious the production was. When the astronauts aboard the Churchill enter the mysterious alien spacecraft hidden inside Halley's Comet, they encounter an environment unlike anything they have seen before. And remarkably, much of what you see was achieved through large-scale physical sets, practical props, mechanical effects, and traditional visual effects techniques. Director Toby Hopper wanted the alien spacecraft to feel fundamentally different from the conventional metallic spaceships audiences were used to seeing in science fiction movies. So instead of looking like a futuristic machine, the vessel was designed to resemble an ancient alien tomb. To achieve this eerie atmosphere, the production team built massive sets featuring curved walls, organic structures, and bizarre biomechanical designs. The result was an environment that felt suspended somewhere between a dream and a nightmare. Perhaps the most impressive aspect of these scenes is the way the astronauts appear to move through the ship. This illusion was created using sophisticated wire harness systems and support rigs. The actors were suspended using nearly invisible cables and instructed to move slowly and carefully, mimicking the movements of real astronauts in space. The filmmakers also employed several clever camera tricks to enhance the effect. In certain shots, actors performed normally, while the camera itself was rotated at unusual angles. This simple but effective technique created the illusion that characters were floating, drifting, or moving in impossible directions. Combined with slow camera movements and carefully choreographed performances, the scenes achieved a remarkably convincing sense of weightlessness. The climax's stabbing sequence was another impressive combination of practical effects and optical illusion. When Colonel Kane drives his weapon into the vampire's abdomen, the impact was created using a combination of a retractable blade and a specially prepared dummy torso. A protective layer and concealed effects piece were used beneath the costume, allowing the blade to appear as though it was penetrating the body while keeping the performer safe. But the scene becomes even more spectacular when the vampire suddenly reveals its true form, a terrifying giant space bat. To create the creature, the effects team built a large internal framework of the vampire bat and covered it with layers of foam latex, giving the bat a fleshy, organic appearance. Detailed surface painting and layers of specially prepared slime were then added to make the creature look like a grotesque alien organism rather than an ordinary bat. The enormous creature was then operated as a practical puppet. A complex system of cables, mechanical controls, and support mechanisms allow the puppeteers to control different parts of the creature's body from outside the camera's view. With carefully coordinated movements, the team could make the bat's wings flap, its jaws open, and its body thrash around as it appeared to writhe in pain. The result was a completely physical creature performing directly in front of the camera, a perfect example of how Lifeforce used practical creature effects to create one of its most bizarre and memorable horror images. Another bizarre and surprisingly practical moment comes during London's destruction, when Tom Carlson drives an armored Land Rover through the infected streets. As Carlson passes through the chaos, one of the desiccated victims reaches into the vehicle, desperately trying to grab him. But then, in a sudden and disturbing moment, the victim's arm is torn completely away from the body. To create this effect, the production used a specially prepared Breakaway prosthetic arm. The arm was constructed to resemble the dried, lifeless flesh of one of the infected victims, using flexible materials and carefully painted surface details to make it look convincingly organic. The arm was designed with a deliberately weakened breakpoint, so that it could separate at exactly the right moment. The performer could, therefore, appear to be reaching into the vehicle normally, while the artificial arm could be ripped away during the stunt, without putting the actor's real arm in danger. As Carlson continues driving and the infected victim reaches through the window, the fake arm is thrust inside the vehicle. The movement and momentum of the passing Land Rover then provide the force needed to break the prosthetic at its predetermined point. The detached arm was then shown falling inside the vehicle in a separate close-up shot. The broken end was dressed with additional practical gore and dried tissue details, making the inside of the prosthetic look like a genuinely severed, desiccated limb. It's a quick shot, but it's a perfect example of Lifeforce's practical effects philosophy. But perhaps the most technically unusual effect in this sequence was the film's iconic blue Lifeforce energy. Today, a glowing supernatural energy blast could be created almost instantly with computer graphics. In 1985, however, Dijkstra's team had to develop a much more experimental optical process. The strange blue energy that races through the streets wasn't simply a conventional animated effect. The visual effects team experimented with lasers and optical photography, using lasers bounced from a flexible mylar surface to produce unusual streams and patterns of light. These effects were then photographed using rear projection and other optical techniques. The process required an enormous amount of experimentation. According to accounts of the production, the team shot thousands of feet of film while experimenting with different ways of creating the strange, ethereal appearance they wanted. But creating the energy was only half the battle. The effects also had to interact convincingly with live-action performers and environments. Separate footage of the actors and glowing energy elements could be photographed against controlled backgrounds, and then combined through traditional optical printing. Frame by frame, the visual effects artist could layer the luminous energy over the live-action footage and carefully control where it appeared in the image. That painstaking process is what gave Lifeforce's blue energy its strange, almost dreamlike appearance. That's the real magic of Lifeforce. When CGI wasn't available, the filmmakers didn't make the world smaller. They simply found increasingly creative ways to build it in front of the camera. If you enjoyed seeing how these classical practical effects were created, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and stick around for more behind-the-scenes filmmaking breakdowns.